staff. No action will be taken at this workshop, and there will not be an opportunity for public comment. This meeting is streaming live on Glendale's Facebook and YouTube pages and the city's cable television station, Glendale Channel 11. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Glendale City Council Workshop Session of November 8th, Voting Day 2022. This meeting is called to order. We'll conduct attendance roll call. Councilmember Clark.
Here.
Councilmember Hugh.
Here.
Councilmember Milner.
Here.
Councilmember Tomachoff.
Here.
Councilmember Turner. Here. Vice Mayor does have an excused absence, and I'm present. So, Ms. Rabin, if we could go ahead and get item number 1 introduced, please.
Presentation regarding the Unified Development Code, UDC.
Good afternoon, Mayor, members of the council. Here to provide staff report today on item number 1 is Tabitha Perry, our planning manager, and she's joined by Matthew Kaiziko, who's with Michael Baker International.
Thank you. Mayor and council, this afternoon, we're before you this afternoon to present before you the second of 2 city council workshops providing you an update on the UDC. Our goal this afternoon is from when we met before you on April the 26th of this calendar year, is to provide you with an update on changes that we are proposing that you did not hear about on April the 26th, as well as an update on some of the citizen participation feedback that we have received, in addition to some additional components that we're proposing to be potentially incorporated within the proposed UDC. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matt.
Thank you, Tabitha. Thank you, Mayor and Council. Tabitha had a great intro in terms of what our focus for today's workshop is. As we spoke to you last, we got some great feedback, but then we also had the benefit of now receiving more public input, and so with the benefit of that information, we wanted to come back to you and highlight some of the key topics that came out of that outreach so that we can share with you where the code is today regarding those topics and see if you have any responses to that. Again, today is high level. We're not looking to go, word for word through things. We're certainly happy to do that at your preference, but really it's more broad, get a general consensus of direction, and then we obviously will go back and make any necessary adjustments. As far as my talking points today, in your packets you saw we have 9 specific topics that we were going to touch on today. Our thought process is, as I get into each of those topics, we can certainly take questions as they come, since they might be top of mind for that topic, rather than waiting till the end of the discussion. With that, we'll try to be as succinct as possible. So as far as some of the highlights that occurred since our last meeting, we just want to give the council the benefit of recognizing that following our April council workshop, we then went back to the technical review committee, which is made up of staff and department heads within each of the key departments that are impacted by the UDC or zoning code. So we met with staff during the month of May, and then we distributed the UDC for public review in June. After making that available to the public, we then placed it on our project website, of course, and also held 2 in-person meetings to try and garner more feedback. We actually had 1 in-person meeting here in Central Glendale and then another in North Glendale. We advertised through typical channels, as well as getting mailers out for specific council districts. The total resident attendance actually at both of those meetings, we had 1 resident attend. There was no residents that attended the Central Glendale, and then 1 resident attended the North Glendale workshop meeting. Their questions were more focused on inquiries as opposed to comments on the draft code. Following that, you can understand we also married that up with virtual meetings with project stakeholders. So when we kicked this project off, we had a in-person meeting with project stakeholders. That was sparsely attended. We pivoted this time around and reached out to a handful of stakeholders to have virtual meetings in order to get a broad feedback from different stakeholders, as you can see on the screen, relative to property owners, developers, attorneys, and the like. And so we got great feedback through that modified approach as opposed to our first attempt when we had an in-person meeting. We then had just recently reviewed the draft with the Planning Commission, and they gave some great feedback on really the topics that we'll be going over with you this afternoon. And then lastly, I would say that we're taking all of these comments, putting them into a comment matrix and tracking where and what or how we address those comments. So in addition to all of the individual efforts we did, you can certainly know, especially for those in the audience, that we received council feedback independently of the April collective workshop. And so all of that information, whether it was through our public outreach efforts or through additional feedback from individual council members or through the Planning Commission, all of those comments are consolidated in this comment review matrix, and then that will help us keep track of any questions that come up through the adoption process about how we responded to a certain inquiry and where that lives within the code itself. If any council members have questions in terms of process, I can pause there. Otherwise, I will move forward. Okay, hearing none. We'll jump right into it then because I know we have some other topics to discuss this afternoon, so I'll try to be as focused as possible. The first topic we wanted to bring forward is the neighborhood notification requirements. So this is, if you're following along in the code overall, it's actually page 219 of the overall UDC. But as far as the neighborhood notification requirements, we thought that it would be beneficial to at least highlight for council. The current zoning code utilizes a standard notification distance of 300 feet for most or many of our zoning procedures. So whether it's a general plan amendment or a rezone, you'll see in this chart, yes, the mouse isn't working, but if you see the highlighted column there with the text, what is in parentheses is indicating what the current code identifies. So right now, for a general plan amendment in that top row, there is no distinction between the size of application types. Whether you're a 5-acre project or a 300-acre project, the notification boundary is the same, 300 feet. What we heard through public outreach and input is wanting to look at different notification sizes for different size projects. So as we can imagine, as the size of the project grows, the impacts to the area often grow, and therefore a larger notification is something that was of interest to residents and community stakeholders as we went through the process. So you can see that we broke that down from 40 acres or less, 40 acres to 120 acres, and then 120 acres or more. And so we identified different notification distances, but also for reference, we included on this slide some benchmark communities to see how they approach it. So just for your reference, in Peoria, they have a 300-foot notification for their site plans and variants, but then have a range of 600 feet to 1320 for their general plan amendments, rezones, and conditional use permits. So you can see they apply that kind of variable in terms of some of their zoning procedures. Surprise actually approaches it a little different. They require a public notice. So rather than even notify adjacent properties, they're actually requiring all projects to notify in the newspaper. So that is more of a broad notification, but Sometimes we all know that residents don't read the newspaper, and so that we thought might be problematic. And then last, Scottsdale actually utilizes different notification boundaries, but in detail for rezone and general plan amendments, they have a notification boundary of 750 feet. So again, just to emphasize that we were looking at in specifics from general plan amendment to the rezoning, adjusting the notification limits based on the size of the application request.
Got a question for you.
Yes.
Thank you, Mayor. So Scottsdale, the 750 feet, that's regardless of the size of the rezone case? Just a
Correct.
standard 750 no matter what?
Correct. Just for those application types, rezone and general plan amendments, the distance changes for some of their other notification types.
Okay, and I don't want to get ahead of you, but we seek conditional use permits and things like that. Are there going to be comparables to other cities in that case as well?
In terms
We require the 300 feet. Are we looking at changing that? I know, did we look at benchmark cities to see where we are with other cities?
we did look at conditional use permits. So in terms of some of these communities, as you can see, for Peoria, it was a larger distance. Then Surprise utilizes that broadcast approach. Conditional use permits, we frequently look at those as being smaller footprint requests, not always. So that's why the thought process was to keep it at that 300 feet. But we can certainly, if we have a concern from council that that may be too limiting, we could take another look at that.
Mayor, if I could, one of the highest, I think, uses that we issue those for is drive-throughs, which can be a little bit on the disruptive side depending on how close they are to residential. So I don't know whether we'd want to take a look at that, but that was something that I'd like to see, depending on where and what the use is. Especially some certain types of drive-throughs that generate, Dutch Bros comes to mind.
Yes.
They can be a little disruptive, so we might want to take a look at that.
Yeah, I loved your comment on where and type of use. So I think we can certainly circle back on that
Okay.
and see if there's an opportunity.
Very good, thank you.
Another question.
Yes.
Thank you, Mayor. About the whole issue of distance, or of the 300-foot distance, is that a mandatory requirement? Is it something that is imposed by the state, or is it something that was invented by cities and they've all kind of followed along?
There are some mandated distances, but this 300-foot requirement is something that's kind of a baseline for communities.
Okay. All right. Knowing that it's not necessarily mandatory, has there been any consideration given to, instead of using a distance requirement, using adjacent neighborhoods? I will give you an example that has occurred over and over and over again. There may be a infill project that's surrounded by residential neighborhoods, and whether it's 300 feet or 900 feet, it's usually one row of homes within that neighborhood that is notified, and the entire rest of the neighborhood has no idea what's happening. I think that in some instances, it might be prudent to look at requiring the development to notify adjacent neighborhoods rather than using a distance requirement. So maybe we could have alternatives, distance requirement under some circumstances, and maybe for infill projects, consider using adjacent neighborhoods notification.
And I think that's an excellent observation. And of course, as usual, Councilmember Clark, you're spot on. We experience that in a lot of communities where the whole neighborhood questions why they weren't notified. The typical expectation is that when you get into these notification districts, distances, you would often capture a common area that is under the control of the HOA, and then that's how they're notified, but I think I hear what you're saying is let's make that not a happenstance, but actually a definitive requirement to identify what those neighborhoods are and notify them.
Yes, and I think reliance upon HOAs is great if a neighborhood has an HOA.
Right.
But there are many neighborhoods in my district that don't have HOAs. And therefore, except for that one row of homes, nobody knows what's coming to their neighborhood. So I really think this deserves some serious consideration.
We'll definitely take that back and review some opportunities to see how we can incorporate that approach.
Thank you.
And I think it's encouraging to hear that council recognizes that this is an important part of the UDC because it is just one table, but yes, it can impact a lot of feedback, so.
Thank you.
Mayor?
Well, did you have anything?
I don't at the moment.
Good.
Thank you, Mayor. And Councilmember Clark's point's well taken, but I still think there probably should be some sort of a distance because, for example, in a planned community such as Stonehaven, where you're talking about 1,200 homes or something, that requirement would seem to be a little bit steep.
Yeah,
So I think you would have to still figure out how to quadrant or something. That would be a lot to ask of somebody to notify 1,200 home, in my opinion anyway, that would be a lot. So neighborhood, yes, but what exactly would you mean by neighborhood? I think there'd still have to be some sort of a distance overlay in the notification requirement there.
right.
That's a big ask, 1,200 homes.
I think that might be a good point of clarification, is that I think I was hearing that we would identify the contact or identified contact for that HOA or that community, but that we wouldn't be necessarily notifying the entire neighborhood individually unless Councilmember Clark, that was your.
I would just like to comment that in the great scheme of things, when you have projects that are going to cost $1 million or better, which is the minimum price for a development project today, that the cost of mailing to adjacent neighborhoods might come to maybe several $1,000s, $2,000 maybe, max. That's inconsequential in terms of the overall cost of the project. And I think it's something that the development community can bear and should bear to be a good neighbor to the area in which they plan to locate. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in here. I think they're both right. But I think that there's a way to do that. It's inconsequential. $2,000 is nothing unless it's your $2,000. Then all of a sudden it does become something. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't do some sort of electronic notification of the area, which is far less money than trying to send out a mailer. At the same time, still have that footage requirement. I think there's a way you can both sort of,
Right.
I think there'd be a good balancer.
And signs have to be posted too, so that's, that's another means of notification.
Yeah, I think council's starting to do the work for us in terms of that's how we would approach this feedback is go look at how we can recognize the challenges of both applications and see how we can get something that's best fit. Might not be perfect. But. Great, okay, excellent feedback. Greatly appreciate that detail. So we'll just keep moving along, talking about planned residential developments, PRDs. If it's okay with council, many of the following slides are kind of set up with existing zoning information on the left and proposed PRD or zoning information on the right. I'll allow council and those in the audience to kind of read the existing code if needed for reference. I'm just going to focus my comments on the proposed and try to be succinct in that way. So for council's benefit and reminder, we really have kind of two primary tools right now that can be utilized to assist in the development of larger master plan communities. We have a PAD process and a PRD process, and that's very common for many communities. The PRD process is usually utilized to make subtle adjustments to the development standards within specific zoning districts, within some framework, not open-ended changes, but a limited amount of changes in order to make a certain development type work for that project. Whereas a PAD is a more robust application that actually would be looking at changing the entire zoning and development standards for a particular project. So right now, the zoning code for a PRD process requires it to follow the same approval process as a PAD. So we have these two tools, a PRD and a PAD, that have kind of different purposes, yet we're currently requiring them to go through the same review process. The PRD process is usually utilized on an administrative approach because it's looking at making limited changes and being more responsive to applicants' overall timeline. And then if the request becomes too great, then it triggers that kind of PAD process, which is viewed as more of a typical commission and council process. So right now, I think for conversation purposes, the PRD draft that is in the code looks at allowing the development standards, except for density, to be adjusted with limitations. So those limitations are captured in the draft right now. I won't go over those in detail, but they give limitations on how much you can adjust the lot width or how much you can adjust the setback or lot coverage, so as that the request doesn't get too broad that it would trigger more of a PAD than a PRD. We also expanded that PRD to include not only the single residence districts in SR and R1 districts, but also looking at multiple residence districts. So all of this then would be, as I mentioned, utilizing the administrative review process for approval of a PRD. The administrative review process does include in the current draft of the code that if this project or a project was adjacent to residential development, that it would have to notify, if it's adjacent within 300 feet to a residential zone property, it would have to notify surrounding properties of this PRD request. So there is a public notification process even within the administrative review process of this PRD, but it does not ultimately, as currently proposed, go to Planning Commission or Council. So with that, I'll pause to see if there's questions.
Mayor,
Good.
thank you. I get nervous when you want to use PRD on suburban residents. In my view, whether it's a PRD or a PAD, we often allow the applicant a great deal of leeway. And that great deal of leeway may be to the harm of a suburban residence area. I'm not okay with including suburban residences in a PRD. Also, we're proposing that the PRD be done through an administrative review process. Okay, if that's the case, I think a report should be given to the Planning Commission and the City Council of what the standards, the current standards are, and what administratively is being changed within those standards. Because most times, Planning Commission has no idea, and Council has no idea what changes have been granted administratively. And I think at least a heads up, knowing what the administrative changes that have been granted are would be helpful to both the Planning Commission and the City Council.
Mayor?
That's it.
Thank you, sir.
Your
To this
microphone on?
point, I'm sorry, what, it's off again?
Oh, there you go.
To this point, thank you, Councilmember Clark. I have reservations about making it strictly administrative review. I do believe that having these come through the commission and to the council as they do currently could be helpful. We had one at our last meeting, as I recall, that I think we all found informative, and these are the kinds of changes that I think council should be aware of, the trend lines, you know, and what developers are asking for or what makes a project doable, those sorts of things. I think it's good for us to follow more closely than just a memo. How do we don't have benchmark communities noted here. How do other cities handle this that we compete with?
Yeah, so we certainly could share benchmark communities. One example would be City of Phoenix utilizes the PRD process. They utilize within theirs, actually, it's not necessarily administrative review process in the fact that they have specific provisions. And if you can stay within those provisions, then you can utilize the PRD zoning tool. So they even kind of are more streamlined in that aspect. So we were trying to be very sensitive to both of, if we're going to have two tools, should they utilize, different processes to make them different tools? Because if we're going to require the PRD to necessarily go through the same approval process, do we even need a PRD tool? Because they're ultimately going to be seeking generally the same approvals. So that was kind of the balancing act of looking at some other communities and how they might streamline it compared to putting some checks and balances into this process. So we're obviously happy to approach it in the way that makes council most comfortable.
Mayor, if I may, so it occurs to me too that if we streamline it too much, then every residential development will go that route, and none of them that will have the actual oversight and eyes on that the commission and the council provide.
And so that, excellent point. And in terms of on page 53, when we explain what they can adjust within their development standards. So for example, the lot width. In no case shall the minimum lot width of the underlining zoning district be reduced by more than 5 feet, except no lots dedicated to single-family detached land usage shall have a lot width less than 40 feet. So it goes on to have specific standards for lot width and setbacks and lot size. So we were mindful of that concern. Whether this hits the mark, is part of that conversation, but we were sensitive to that notion that we didn't want it to be a free-for-all. There are definitely bumpers with this tool, as I will call it, but we can certainly relook at bringing it back through the commission and council, but we just knew up front some of the feedback through stakeholders was, why does the PRD have the same review process as the PAD?
Yes, sir. Thank you. And Mayor, if I may, it just feels to me like we streamline this too much, and I think we're on the edge of that at least, that we're eviscerating our zoning code and the delineations within it, and we're basically just watering those down to this new standard with the allowed variations. And that's not necessarily what I want to do. I'm not convinced that that's best for our community and for our neighborhoods and for our future residents in particular. Thank you.
Mr. Phelps?
Mayor, members of council, so again, just as a reminder that the current administrative review process is capped at 10%. And the reason there's a room for the administrative process is because when you're doing a large development, there's a lot of kind of ebb and flow of trying to fit a development into a parcel. So for example, currently, let's say the height restriction in an area is 52 feet. The most that you can do administratively would be to increase that amount by essentially 5 feet. If there's a side yard setback that is 4 feet, again, the most you could do then would be 10% of that 4 feet. So it's designed to kind of help shoehorn so not everything keeps going back and forth, kind of through the Planning Commission. And I believe the recommendation is to keep the administrative cap in place. Is that correct, Tabitha? Yeah, so again, so again, it is limited how much relief can be done. It's mostly just so you can fit in, especially odd parcel sizes, they push out. The code may say specifically you have to have this much of a side yard setback or a backyard setback, and it may not just fit. But it isn't just we can go from a 40-foot height to 60 feet height without going back to the process. So I hope that's helpful.
In this case, I concur with Councilmember Turner. And I think he made a very good point in that we relax standards so much that residential developers will opt for a PRD knowing that they can avoid certain steps in the process. That I don't like. I think that citizens are entitled to weigh in, which is what the Planning Commission is. It's a citizen body. I think we as representatives of the people in our districts are entitled to weigh in as well. You said something that now I'm confused. You talked about a width of 40 feet on a lot size?
We just we recognized as we were going through this that obviously there are some very small single-family detached lot sizes. And
Yes.
we were making the provision that you can adjust it by 5 feet, but there's a threshold of the lot gets so narrow that we weren't willing to allow that to be even narrower. So that 40 feet is you can't have a lot less than 40.
But if you put SR zoning districts into this matrix, that means that my 1 acre property, if I were to redevelop, I could have lots considerably smaller within my 1 acre property. Yes or no?
We only, no, in the sense that we only allow a 5-foot adjustment. So,
Okay.
so one is even if you had a large width for your lot, you can only adjust it 5 feet, whatever zoning district you're in. The other aspect to keep in mind is that density is not changing. So as Kevin mentioned, we're looking to have a tool to allow adjustments for select conditions. We're not trying to give them more development potential. It's just trying to recognize that there might be some nuances that if we made just a subtle adjustment, we wouldn't have to go through the entire PAD process. And so we are not allowing that density to change, and we're also saying if you're going to make these other adjustments, that the open space has to go up. So we are making provisions of beyond just limitations, allowing for
And I appreciate your commentary, but I would prefer that there is oversight by Planning Commission and by City Council. Thank you.
Great. Excellent feedback noted in terms of that process, and we'll certainly look at how we can incorporate those comments to meet your preferences. Moving on to accessory uses. When we're looking at accessory uses, what we wanted to just bring to the council's attention is that for this draft, we're breaking out the accessory use type. So right now, they're all kind of captured as one type of accessory use. So for any property, you have a principal use that's allowed on that parcel or lot. And then any accessory use that is associated with that has specific requirements in the current zoning code. And we're obviously maintaining that approach, which is very common in any zoning code to have accessory use requirements. But rather than group them all together, the current code focuses more on residential accessory uses. We have accessory uses on all development types in Glendale. So we broke out the development requirements to focus on uses, buildings, and structures. So it's recognizing that there might be unique needs for those different types. So if I'm a use, I'm storage, I might need different set of requirements than if I'm a detached garage, which would be a building, compared to a gazebo, which would be a structure. So that was the first nuance that we took consideration of. The other is we looked at the guidance for size, location, and materials. So we unified the approach in terms of setback. So we're applying a universal setback of 2 feet for each foot over 7 feet in height up to the principal building setback. So if a building is over 7 feet, any foot above that, you have to add 2 feet for every foot that you go above 7 feet, is what I'm trying to explain. We also looked at providing exceptions for movable structures, so like play structures and things like that, doghouse or those types of things. We recognized and have unique provisions for movable structures. Alley conditions is something that came up very early on in the zoning process, and so accessory uses recognize alleys and needing a 0 setback for a garage, for example. A detached garage that might access an alley has a different consideration than the principal building itself. And then also size, the size limitation of the accessory building. So right now, the proposed code limits the size of the accessory building to the footprint of the principal building. So not the total square footage. So if it's a 2-story building, it's looking at the footprint of that building would drive the maximum size of the accessory use, with exceptions, as you can see in certain zoning districts. For example, in our ag zoning or our rural residential zonings, we allow different applications in larger footprint buildings because those accessory uses, like a barn or something to that example, might have a larger footprint than the principal building. So the last comment would be, we also recognize that there was discussions and conversations about the type of material that's used for accessory buildings. We were very particular about word choice on this. We didn't want to get into identifying a long list of approved material types to not approved. So the approach was to state must be constructed of material that has visual appearance of the principal building, but not going so far as mandating that it be built of the same material as the principal building. So with that, I'll yield to Mayor and Council.
Yes, you're good on that one.
All right.
Mayor, I do have just one clarification, if I would, before we move on. First bullet point on the right-hand side, it's a universal additional setback of 2 feet. So that's, every property has its setback. Then if it's over 7 feet, it will be 2 feet taller for every foot of height.
Yes, so right now, great clarification. Right now, if you're 7 feet or below, it's a 3-foot setback. And then as you go above that, that's when the 2 foot for every 1 foot starts to kick in.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor, one question.
Go ahead.
You didn't mention storage sheds in this. Did you eliminate that and throw that into some other category?
We maintain the storage shed language, and that falls into that movable structure consideration. So we did preserve the provisions for that, but recognize that buildings and larger types of habitable space would require some additional guidance beyond storage shed.
If I may, Mayor, is there direction as far as what we call storage containers or storage? In my district, there's been some concerns about very large storage containers that somewhat meet our current code but are very obnoxious looking. Did we address that at all?
Yes, we do have some language relative to cargo containers, but we did not have that for presentation this afternoon. I was trying to see if I could pull it up real quick. But overall, we don't strictly regulate those. It is certainly something that we could go back and revisit if council desired. But right now, we don't have any comments to present to the council on that specific item.
My follow-up is I believe that should be a consideration. At least from my residents' perspective, where we've had some issues come up regarding those. And because they meet setback, they meet, height requirements, and maybe that you will take care of that because they don't meet, it doesn't, it's not constructed of similar material. And so maybe that will affect it. And if it does, that's fine, but it needs to be addressed somewhere, in my opinion.
Yes, so I was able to find it, so thank you for giving me some time to locate it. On page 122 of the draft code, we do have cargo container language. The first provision states cargo containers shall be allowed in the A1 zoning district and in association with any non-residential use allowed in all other zoning districts. Containers that are designed to be used for storage and appear to be cargo containers, yet do not meet the specifications for commercial shipping, packing, or transportation of freight shall comply with the requirements of this section. So it goes on to have some additional requirements relative to that, but at least from your comment, Councilmember Malnar, from a residential standpoint, right now the draft code limits them to the A1 zoning district.
So it's limited to A1 zoning. Okay, thank you.
Okay, hearing no more comments, we'll move on to tiny homes. This was a topic, and if anybody, pauses on HGTV, they certainly probably have come across tiny homes. And this is a topic that had come up periodically through this update effort of residents and developers asking about tiny homes. I think this is maybe one of those instances where we may have got a little too focused and might want to pull back in terms of where the draft language is. When we first started looking at tiny homes, we were looking at it from the vantage point of an accessory use. That's where we most get the inquiries is, I have my principal building and my lot, now can I put a tiny home as accessory use? And so we went in and provided a definition for what would be considered a tiny home, identified where those uses would be allowed, and then had specific provisions drafted for the two types of tiny homes that are prevalent. That's a non-mobile tiny house, which is site-built, right? And then mobile tiny homes that are actually approved to be driven on our roads. So we have specific provisions for those tiny homes relative to being an accessory use. Once we got through that effort, we then looked at, well, do we want to even say that a tiny house would be allowed on any lot? Because we, in essence, aren't limiting the size of a home on any particular lot. So that tiny home term was then put in the principal use table and shown to be allowed in specific districts as a principal use. But there was concern, as you can see in the red there, that that would be promoting that type of development in single-family zones, and that would impact the character and density of those districts. First, there would be no impact to density because the parcel is the parcel. You can put a tiny home on it, but you're not going to be able to put more than one tiny home on that parcel. So it wouldn't change density, but we respect and understand the concern about neighborhood character. And so right now, the code is in essence silent on if you own a property, the code doesn't indicate how big the home on that property should be. And so given that there's concern about explicitly identifying tiny homes as a use type, principal use type, the other consideration that council can talk about this afternoon is simply limiting tiny home discussion to accessory uses and keeping the code as is in terms of principal uses are allowed on a lot, a single-family detached home. It's up to the property owner to define what that home is, but not explicitly call out tiny homes as a type of residential principal use.
Thank you. So what would be the difference between a tiny home and a casita?
So in the current code right now, a casita or a guest house as an accessory use is limited to a kitchenette. And so a kitchenette doesn't, in essence, have a range or oven. So there was concern when we were looking at accessory uses about allowing accessory uses with a full kitchen could potentially create conditions where you have multiple, in essence, families living on one lot. And so a lot of communities, it's very common to limit the accessory use to a kitchenette to try to control the excessive, I'll say, application or use of that accessory structure. So right now, that would be the difference between a tiny home would have a full-blown, kitchen, whereas a casita would just be a kitchenette. So you would have a fridge, a sink, and maybe a microwave.
So, and you said that a tiny home would have a full kitchen?
Correct.
And so would that change I'd actually had Ms. Perry helped a custom builder that I know that had emailed me back in the spring and said that because we were one of the more difficult cities to deal with when it came to casitas anyway, especially for especially now, people have aging parents and things like that. They want to be able to keep them on the property, and as long as all the other setbacks are met, they want to, especially with the high cost of housing also. So I just want to make sure I have a good understanding of the difference and why we would allow a full kitchen in a tiny home and not in a casita.
And so, yes, there's a lot of moving parts on this one. We have, to answer or to respond, I should say, to that first observation is that we have accessory dwelling units, which is what we refer to them as. They can be detached or attached. So in many communities, they recognize this nuance that a detached accessory structure, again, right now within the code, only limits it to a kitchenette. If it becomes attached, we had a long conversation about this, so you see a lot of homes where it's multi-generational, and so it does have a casita, if you will, but it's actually attached to the home. That we would not restrict whether it's a kitchen or not, because it's all one structure. There was a consideration for detached accessory dwelling unit compared to an attached accessory dwelling unit. And then we had the provision of tiny homes. And so we were trying to balance all those different considerations. So we can certainly make it unified that all accessory dwelling units, whether you're a tiny home or some other building type, would just be limited to a kitchenette. And then again, as far as principal uses, just limit the code to say single-family detached residential with no guidance in terms of size for those on a typical residential parcel.
Okay, I think the idea, Mayor, if I could, would be just to make it as, I guess, as least confusing as possible for people. And I mean, I understand you don't want to have people building, a casita back there that they can use as a rental. I know it's allowed in, I know they do it a lot in California. But I understand the reason for not doing that too. You've doubled the traffic. There's lots of reasons for not allowing that. But then we allow group homes where there's 10 bedrooms under a home that was built as a 3-bedroom or a 4-bedroom home. So I don't know exactly where we draw the line, but I'm confused right now on this issue, and I would imagine it would be confusing for somebody saying, I want to have a dwelling unit for my parents. I've got enough room to be able to do it with the lot coverage and the setbacks and everything else that I have to follow. But I don't want to only give them just a microwave to cook out of. The idea is that they can be relatively independent. So, and then the attached part too is, attached by a breezeway, or, how attached does it have to be?
Yeah, and all great observations. I can say we considered all that in terms of how it's attached. So that is captured in the draft code. But you touch on kind of a policy consideration that every community looks at. You're spot on in terms of there's some communities that have no regulation on accessory dwelling units, so you can have a full kitchen, Scottsdale being one of them. And then other communities that are very sensitive to this aspect of not wanting them to become long-term dwelling situations, and therefore they limit that. And so that is certainly up for conversation from council standpoint if there's a strong preference in one approach.
Mayor, while I still have the floor, I think that we should allow the full kitchens. That's my personal opinion, especially, I know that there was something that we had before where we would only allow it to be occupied for a certain number of months or something like that, and I think we've stopped that. Have we?
Mayor, Council, we still have that in existing zoning ordinance today.
Okay, could you, Mayor, could you say what the regulation is? I think it's no longer than 6 continuous months or something like that, or?
Mayor, Council, I apologize. I don't have the zoning ordinance in front of me, but I'll paraphrase what it basically says. So if it's less, I believe it's less than 90 or 120 days that an individual can be there, but if it's to have someone reside there longer than that, then they will have to go for a conditional use permit approval.
Okay. I guess that does make sense. But I mean, from my personal perspective, I think that allowing, a fully functioning kitchen in a casita isn't problematic. At least I don't see the problem with that, especially if we're going to allow them in tiny homes. Thank you.
I'm going to add on to what Councilmember Tomachoff just said. It seems to me if you have a fully functioning kitchen, that potentially would be safer than trying to have a couple little burners that people are trying to turn into a regular kitchen, and then you have the possibility of fires. Personally, I think it would be safer. And secondly, I don't know if the verbiage you were using, casita, compared to tiny houses, if we actually differentiate those two. But if we do, I don't know why we do. It seemed like we should just have a certain amount of square footage constitutes a small home, and with that, these requirements, and over that, then these requirements. Just, again, I think make it as simple as possible. I do have a question down here. Your microphone.
Microphone.
I tend to agree with the mayor and Councilmember Tomachoff. I'm not ready to go down the tiny home path yet. What other cities have regulations and have recognized tiny homes?
Actually, there's been a number of communities to recognize tiny homes in different ways. City of Flagstaff has recognized them. The
Here in the
City
valley?
of Tempe has recognized them. We also have some counties that have recognized them, but they all recognize them in different ways. Some are looking at tiny homes as just accessory uses. Some are looking at them as development types, right? That if I have a parcel that would allow it, can I put multiple tiny homes? I'm not saying in a residential, but if it was, some communities are looking at projects coming through that say, I have one parcel, I want to put multiple tiny homes on it and rent those out. Right now, the code would view that type of application as a PAD, and they would have to utilize that tool.
That's what I'm afraid of. You label it a PRD, PAD, and all of a sudden we're blooming with tiny homes. I would rather not make the distinction and keep a casita or whatever, tiny home or whatever it turns out to be, as an accessory use, and if it is going to be used for more than the stipulated time period, that we continue with a conditional use permit. But I don't think I want to call out tiny homes right now and give them a certain status that, I mean, I consider it almost the soup du jour. It's a fad right now, but will it be a fad 30 years from now? So I would rather just be silent as much as possible on the issue and just stick with, if you're going to build an accessory living space on your property and it's going to be a permanent arrangement, get a conditional use permit so that there's some oversight. Thank you.
And I apologize, Councilmember Clark. Did you have a thought on kitchenette?
Yeah, I agree with the mayor and with Councilmember Tomachoff,
Thank you.
but not just for tiny homes. Forget tiny homes. But for casitas, yes, it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, we're just trying to be responsive, so I will say we started with accessory dwelling units and then gut feedback about what are we doing for tiny homes, and so then we started on that path, so we appreciate council kind of pulling us back to where you're comfortable, and happy to make those adjustments.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with the sentiment that Councilmember Tomachoff started, which is to allow for the full kitchen in a accessory living space. And I kind of agree with the tiny home that Councilmember Clark mentioned. That I'm not sure that I'm comfortable saying, yeah, go to Glendale, you can build tiny homes. And I don't want that message. I would rather keep it as an accessory living space under current guidelines that we have, but allowing for a full kitchen.
Thank you, Mayor. I concur that I think we're only fooling ourselves if we don't allow a full kitchen, and with countertop microwaves, toaster ovens, convection ovens, and all of that. If the user of that space needs it, they'll get it. And it does, I think, create the potential for circuit overload and that sort of thing, which would be unsafe. So I don't think we need to restrict the full kitchen concept. I noticed in your presentation, I don't know if it carries on into the UDC, I didn't notice it in time to go double check, but you refer to both tiny homes and tiny houses. Are they the one and the same?
One and the same, yes.
I would ask that we pick one or the other and go with it consistently, so that the definitions will apply and across the board. I'm a little bit interested in the distinction between site-built versus off-site construction, and then mobile as probably a third distinction. I appreciate, I understand the difference, but I'm not sure necessarily why we would distinguish between site-built and off-site constructed in a controlled type environment of a professional construction. Because based on what I've seen, a lot of those look very nice and may well be more desirable than an actual site-built one, which has could be a number of different things, plus the fact that the controlled environment of construction, the inspection and all of that. So I'd like us to be open to using a manufactured, off-site built product, and then the third distinction being mobile. And I don't necessarily want to go to just being allowed to pull a travel trailer into the backyard and leave the axle and the tongue and everything else on it. But should a product be delivered on a trailer or be constructed in a mobile fashion with the design of the mobility being removed from it once it's installed in location, I think that then that, to me, fits the parameters of a site-built construction, even though it wasn't. So
That was an excellent observation of another nuance that we have to balance when we're looking at accessory dwelling units is, though, especially the mobile tiny houses, is to not then have residents ask, well, how is that different than my trailer, as you pointed out. So just from a mobile tiny house standpoint, it's looking at how we can ensure that that looks more stationary as opposed to mobile. Other than that, the provisions for the two types are very similar. So it was only trying to consider that relationship to the recreational vehicles and making a distinction between the two.
okay, and I guess also too, if it's going to be kept in a mobile fashion, tires and tongue, and also if it's going to be registered.
Correct.
And
Correct.
in that as well, I think all comes to play in there. And maybe its original purpose of construction. If something was originally designed as a travel trailer, or whatever term they would be common, then that may not be something that we would want to have adjusted to become a auxiliary dwelling unit. My other concern is that, and I think part of what we're trying to avoid is turning every property into a duplex. And so do we have either proposed or existing square footage relationship between the primary dwelling and any auxiliary dwelling?
So right now, the code is limited, and that's where in the accessory use section, when we're looking at buildings, we applied a size limitation to the footprint of the principal building. So whatever footprint is established by that principal building would dictate the maximum size, still within the lot coverage requirements, right? Lot coverage is always overarching, but also looking at it, we looked at a lot of benchmark communities, and some, use an equation. Others will just utilize a specific size, and we just thought that might be too arbitrary to just pick a random size, because all communities are different, but we can certainly approach it in many different ways if there was a preference from a size standpoint. So,
all right, so it's all accessory buildings, not just the tiny home or living quarters, right? It would, what uses the footprint method.
Correct, with the exception of some of our large lot zoning districts that would have larger accessory buildings.
Barns or storage buildings or outbuildings of that nature, which I'm fine with that. So I'm trying to focus back into our typical residential neighborhoods. If the accessory dwelling unit can have a footprint as large as the main unit, then to me that begins to be more like a duplex. So I realize that if it's two-story, they really only get half the square footage, but I still think, we have very little of that in our community. Most of our construction is single-story. I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with 100% of the footprint. I might be more inclined to have a 50% or less for the accessory dwelling unit, so that it really is obviously accessory, and that it's not just a second full-size dwelling unit on a single-family lot. But I do believe that, we need to incorporate the tiny home and the ADU as a viable living option into our code, given the cost of housing and our desire to, in some areas of town, actually increase that density. And so that may be something, the tiny home concept may be something that the council would take on and wrap our heads around before we formalize the code, these code revisions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on.
Okay, great feedback, though. Greatly appreciate the detail for tiny homes. Now we'll spend a little bit of time talking about recreational marijuana. Again,
It's your favorite, right?
maybe I'll try and be as succinct as possible on this one. We all know that the city has existing medical marijuana requirements. So then, as Prop 207 was approved back in November of 2020 and went into effect in 21 for recreational marijuana, the code is making sure that we recognize that that change in law. That change in law allows communities to approach managing recreational marijuana in certain ways. And so, long story short, this draft code essentially takes the approach which many other communities have, is that we're only allowing dual licensee facilities. So if they have a medical marijuana license and requested a dual license to sell recreational marijuana, that those would be the only facilities that would be allowed to sell recreational marijuana in Glendale, that Glendale would not be allowing standalone recreational marijuana establishments. So that's really I think the key maybe policy decision from a council standpoint that we would be looking at feedback is communities across the state have really looked at that primary distinction is, do we want dual licensees only, or would we entertain facilities that might only have a recreational marijuana license?
Mayor,
Go ahead.
thank you. So I guess the question I have is, how easy is it for someone to get a medical marijuana card to purchase and then they use it for whatever purpose, correct?
There is very strict regulations on how you acquire a medical marijuana license.
No, I'm sorry, not license, for someone to purchase it.
Oh, someone to purchase medical or recreational?
Medical.
Medical marijuana, you would have to get a medical ID card and then go to an establishment as long as you're 21, and you can purchase it at a medical marijuana.
So if we were to regulate not allowing recreation license or facilities, is it just the facade because you can grab the medical card and then use it as recreational? We would never know that, but.
I guess if I understand the question correctly, that I think is how communities are looking at it, in the sense of they went through the medical marijuana process and identified the regulations for those facilities. And that was what was comfortable for each community. And so then when recreational marijuana was approved, most communities just felt, I think, that their provisions on the medical marijuana side were sufficient. Therefore, we're going to limit it to those facilities as opposed to potentially additional ones. So yes, you would not, on the surface, know, driving by, whether it was only medical or recreational.
So let me just be clear, thank you. Are you saying that most communities or municipalities are not allowing the single use or single sale of recreational, they're only doing the medical?
We did not do a comprehensive analysis across the state, but of some benchmark communities we looked at, most are limiting it to dual license facilities.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. So I guess to clarify, right now, all of the dispensaries in Glendale are dual licensed. That's all we have right now? Or do we have any recreational-only dispensaries?
I'm not sure how staff is managing those facilities currently. We do not have a schedule of all the medical marijuana licensees in the city. We were more looking at it just from the code standpoint in terms of the application. We might have to go pull more information for that.
Mayor, Council, currently, we do not have any applications on file for just an establishment that only wants to sell recreational. There may be some establishments now in Glendale that are doing dual, but the city of Glendale, our approach was to try to address the recreational component of it with the UDC.
Mayor, if I could, I think if you think that there's a difference, you're fooling yourself, honestly. I mean, I know that prescriptions are super easy to get, and the amount that you're allowed to buy with a medical marijuana prescription, I believe it's 2 ounces a month, which is an incredible amount that I don't think one person would need. So, not that I would know anything about it, but just want to put that out there. But I just think the idea, I mean, it's a legal licensed business in Arizona, and to be singling out just the recreational use as opposed to requiring a dual license, I wonder even whether we'd be putting ourselves in a legal position where I know that there's some that, people who've served time, I think, are getting special front of the line to get licenses, that sort of thing. So I don't even know whether it would be even prudent for us to be saying, you have to have a medical dispensary in order to have a license. I don't know whether we should do that. But my point is that it's out there, it's legal, people are buying it, they're generating, I think, quite a bit of sales tax revenue, which is what I care about. I mean, we have enforcement. If people, you're not supposed to drive. If you want to enjoy it in the privacy of your own home, feel free to do that. And that there's really a difference between who's using with a card and who's using without a card there's no difference. I mean, a lot of people are probably self-medicating for anxiety and stress and things that don't have a prescription. I know people who were doing that, I mean, it's been a kind of a weird couple of years for all of us. So I don't see what the difference is. I don't know whether for me, there's any reason to differentiate as long as all the other zoning requirements are met as far as how far from a school and all the other things that we would require of a dispensary. My feeling is that the state says it's a legal business. We should treat them like any other business. Thank you.
I don't know for sure, but I believe that there is a big difference, and that's if you have a medical marijuana card, you pay a lower tax fee than you do if you're just buying it recreational. I believe that's correct. Which only sort of goes to enforce what you're saying. Maybe we should ask an expert. Bart?
Thank you, Mayor. That was very clever. Well, just the disclaimer is I am not currently an expert in this field, regardless of any experience I may have had with the product in my younger days. I would say that provided that we use the same regulations, I don't think it's appropriate that we require that they be dual licensed. I think that gets into, personally to me, that's anti-competition, restraint of trade. It's counter to the intention of the voter-approved measure. And I just think that if we've decided that because of the nature of the product, it needs to be restricted as far as its location within our community, I don't think that we need to distinguish further beyond it being medicinal or recreational. And I do think, as was mentioned before, that we're fooling ourselves if we think recreational isn't medicinal and medicinal isn't used recreationally. Thank you.
Mr. Milner.
Thank you, Mayor. Based on what has been said here today, I'm trying I'm in favor of of prohibiting standalone marijuana establishments. And again, I think it follows a standard that other cities have set up, and there's a reason probably for that. And it may be to limit the quantity. I mean, maybe that's part of the reason, and so I'd be in favor of that. I know my residents aren't happy to see a marijuana facility go into their district. So we have sufficient number in our city today. They're medical initially. Now apparently they're converted over to recreation. I'm not sure how they got that license. Did they get that was part of one of my questions. Do existing marijuana facilities that were medical marijuana, did they have a priority in obtaining a dual license?
So they could make a request. And again, I wasn't able to review all of them. My understanding, there's approximately 140 licenses for medical in the state, and practically all of them were given dual license for recreational.
And if I may, Mayor, how many additional licenses are available beyond that 140?
That I have to go back and confirm from a recreational marijuana standpoint of how many additional licenses. I don't have that information.
I would guess there's still quite a few available. And again, my point here is I think we have sufficient with what we have in our city. I know there was one possibly in play still, but by putting this restriction of requiring both, it does limit, to council comment, it is limiting, and I get that. And I'm in favor of that. So I would be in favor of leaving it, as you have recommended, prohibiting standalone marijuana establishments and require that they have dual license.
Mayor?
Let me ask a question for it, because we're going to run out of time like we did last meeting. Can we get this subject brought back with somebody that can answer a lot more questions in detail? Because we're just shooting in the dark right now.
Yeah, we recognize this is a robust topic, so we can certainly pull this out as a standalone discussion.
All right, everybody okay with that?
Yeah, Mayor, if I may add, maybe our staff can help. I'd like to see data on crime statistics in some of the facilities we have around in Glendale now, even some of our neighboring cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. With that, we'll move on to parking. This one we talked about in our last meeting back in April, so hopefully it's a quick discussion. But we just wanted to pause on this because it's always top of mind as part of the review process from whether it's residents or stakeholders. But just to confirm for council's benefit, we're only talking about off-street parking here for non-residential uses. And so this specific slide, we just want to highlight that we went through first the table of use types. So in each zoning district, we updated the permitted use table to be more modern with those types of uses that we're seeing develop in our community. So in order to match that revision, we then updated the table within the parking section of the code and then applied updated parking ratios for that. So first, we right-sized the parking requirements. There are some feedback that we got through multiple channels from our stakeholders that we might be revisiting some of those ratios, but overall, we're looking at trying to make sure we're not over-parking our community. The other aspect is we enhanced guidance for common building conditions. So we recognize that a lot of projects might be shell developments, and so we have parking provisions relative to that. And then thirdly, we also looked at the parking justification study. So we wanted to make sure that here are the standards from a parking requirement, but without fail, there's always a project that comes through that says this parking ratio does not take into consideration this nuance for our proposed project. So rather than be very stringent on that, we have a parking justification study that has very strict standards that an applicant can pay a consultant to prepare that justification study and propose a revised parking ratio for their specific development project. And then that would be reviewed reviewed by staff to consider if that was acceptable or not for the parking consideration. Also to make note, above and beyond that parking justification study, some other tools that we implemented into the UDC to make it more consistent with comparable or benchmark communities is utilizing joint use parking standards. So recognizing that on some properties that have multiple uses on the same property that might have different peak times for that use. You know, there might be a church and daycare, for example, or something. And so if they have different peak times, can they share their parking area from a joint use standpoint as opposed to having separate parking requirements in a larger parking area? We also looked at off-site parking conditions, recognizing that some parcels, when they're being reused, might have parking requirements that limit their ability to fit that on the existing parcel. And so to encourage that reuse or infill pieces, we also provided off-site parking regulations that said if you can secure parking off your property with certain limitations in terms of distance and how and where it's located, that off-site parking could be an issue. We also looked at bicycle parking and passenger loading. So loading is addressed in zoning codes often, but passenger loading, now that we have rideshare and all of that being more prevalent, the code looked and provided provisions relative to passenger loading to round out those various tools to, again, give flexibility, but be definitive in terms of regulating off-street parking for non-residential. So with that, I'll pause to see if there's any questions relative to it.
Thank you, Mayor. In the portion of your study where you were right-sizing the parking ratios, did you look at handicap parking at all? And if so, were there any adjustments made there?
We did not specifically look at the handicap parking ratio requirement.
Thank you. And Mayor, if I could, is that a local decision or is it governed at higher levels?
To a certain extent, that's just a local consideration.
Okay. Just personal experience, there never seemed to be enough at my mother's doctor's offices, but there always seemed to be plenty at
Home Depot or something.
Home Depot and Lowe's and even Walmart and places like that. So I don't know if we have our ratio fine-tuned or not, or whether it's the council's pleasure to look at that. Thank you.
Go ahead.
So just to clarify, what this is saying is that we're open to reducing down the parking space requirement based on some other factors.
They would have to, yeah, we have a very specific list in terms of all the metrics that they would have to follow, especially industry standards on what they're utilizing to support their requirement, that they have to, reference specific professional standards. But yes, overall, the parking justification study would be an alternative to allowing applicants to recognize a specific nuance for their project.
So, for example, like bars and restaurants and things that are more related to hospitality type things have probably a much higher level of using a rideshare type thing than you would see maybe at a grocery store or a Home Depot, or I can't imagine, like maybe some people use a rideshare to go to those kinds of places, but the frequency, I think, is much higher for some of those other entertainment-type uses. So we would factor that in and telling them how many spaces are required?
Correct.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, moving on. Temporary signs and murals, another robust topic that we'll try and get through quickly here. The first thing I would just want to remind council is that when we're talking about signs, we're trying to balance a lot of different aspects in signage. So we're not trying to be, tunnel vision relative to just regulating signs. We want to be friendly to our businesses. So you can see we got a lot of feedback through this process from multiple stakeholders in the development arena or the sign arena itself. So this is something we continue to refine based off of feedback. But one of the comments we had was just inquiring about temporary signs and murals. So I would just offer that this slide is intended to remind everyone that within the draft code, we have signage that is relative to building signs, signs for site signs. Then we have temporary signs, and I'll talk about murals lastly. But again, from a temporary sign standpoint, we need to make sure that our temporary signs are READ compliant. So that is the Reed versus Town of Gilbert Supreme Court ruling that in essence said that signage needs to be content neutral. So you can't regulate signs based on the content that's on the sign. You have to regulate signs based off of the description of the sign. Is it a wall sign? Is it a pylon sign? You can't call out a sign and require someone to have to read it in order to interpret how it's being applied. So with that, you can see that we had to get creative in how we refer to signs. So now we have weekend directional signs instead of an open house sign. We have yard signs instead of realtor signs, because again, it's kind of a play on words of having to address that READ compliant aspect. When we come to murals was something that came up quite a bit. One of the things we have to be particular about is right now in the code, you can see the two images on the slide. We have some murals in town that residents and others are very fond of. And then we have others, which would be, for example, the top image. The bottom image is another example of where even business owners are kind of raising their hand of saying, well, is this a mural or is it a sign in terms of the type of imagery on that building and what they're selling in that building. So there's a couple things that we have to balance here when we're looking at murals. We have to be very sensitive to free speech. So right now in Glendale, we don't manage paint type. So we do have to be careful when we're trying to dictate how a property owner might place a mural on their property. And because we don't have a universal provision on murals, the current code was taking the approach that we would utilize and have an administrative permit that would use the design review process. So because we don't, I think what we heard is that the community still sees value in murals. So we do want to allow them in some way. It starts to become challenging to identify what is an acceptable mural and what isn't, because it's in the eye of the beholder to some degree. So what we're proposing here is that the current code has provisions about what makes something a mural compared to a sign, that you can't have a logo of the business, it can't relate to what the business is selling, or else that can be, and there's case law on it, interpreted as a sign. If it's just a mural that's painted on the side of a building, then the current code would view that as being acceptable, but have that mural go through the design review process only from the standpoint of making sure that it doesn't have any provisions that would indicate that it's a sign. I want to be clear that we would get into a slippery slope if we started critiquing actually the imagery of the mural. The design review process would only be utilized to, in essence, make sure that the applicant doesn't pay someone to paint it and then the city come along and say you have to, paint over it.
So there's one other thing that I think has to be addressed. What about temporary murals? And the reason I bring that up is not too terribly long ago, 3 or 4 years ago, I think it was, we had the opportunity for a professional to do a mural in chalk on the side of a building for a weekend event that would have gone away the first time that you had a rain or simply a pressure washer. And the city came out and flatly refused and told them absolutely no way, which I completely disagreed with. I thought that was wrong. So there has to be a way of identifying if it's something like out of chalk that is absolutely temporary. I don't even know why we're even regulating that. And I agree with whether it's advertising or just a mural. I get that, but again, I think you need to have a subcategory in there for something like that.
Thank you, Mayor. We do not have a category recognizing temporary murals, so a good observation.
Mayor? Yeah, thank you. This is only specific to commercial and businesses and nothing on residential. And I have an example for you if you answer the negative.
Depending on where that residence is, because HOAs obviously will have certain level of regulations, but to some extent, murals are not restricted in a residential setting. But the language was envisioned to be managing it on commercial or non-residential properties.
Well, thank you for that. And let me just give you an example. There's an area in my district that there's a mural on the corner property where the CMU wall, the block wall, faces the community, not an adjacent property. And there was a mural there, and it's still there, and we tried working with the homeowners. It's not aesthetically pleasing to the rest of the neighborhood, and they try to get it removed, but there's no ordinance that states that. Is that correct? And can you explain that? Is that because it's private property still?
Yes, I can't speak to, the history of that specific, but in terms of that example, that's that challenge that we come up against in terms of that notion of free speech and the fact that we don't have a universal prohibition of murals, for example. So that is something that communities struggle with. And City of Phoenix, for example, had their mural program and then started to get pushback on that. And so they had they explored this exact topic as well and found that it was too challenging, and they looked at multiple communities and they were all approaching it in different ways and ended up preserving what they currently have, which is generally no regulations from a mural standpoint. So
there's no regulation, and then you can't simply regulate the content of that mural on that private property.
that would be a challenge.
Thank you.
Building that face.
Yeah.
Yeah, they got some issues.
Thank you, Mayor. Before we leave signage, couple of things. This doesn't specifically address it, but we are keeping the definition of temporary signage and that it's allowed for a certain period of time associated with certain events such as holidays or grand openings or anniversaries, that sort of thing.
Oh, yes, we have specific provisions for all these temporary sign types. So if it's an A-frame sign, that has different regulations than if it's a banner for, weekend sale, for example. So all of those various sign types have very specific regulations that I will speak. Councilmember Clark's business committee was very instrumental in helping guide crafting that language.
So to be clear, we are retaining our regulations regarding the feather or blade type signs and the falling man sign,
Yes, and
all
I
that
think
type of.
getting more regulation on those to be,
Okay, and as this clarity continues, then we'll be able to see stricter, more uniform enforcement from our code department on those.
that is certainly the intent.
The other thing that is tangential, I will give it best, is the electronic message board displays. And, high schools have had those for a long time. I notice now that a couple of our city facilities, Foothills Rec and, and Councilmember Clark's Hero Clark's Park, have those. I've also noticed that they've creeped in with the pricing on gasoline stations. I can see that there is a point to having this, but I'm not sure that it's something we want to have proliferate. So, I've heard that a couple of churches have them, though that perhaps those were done by mistake. But I think we need to, and I don't know how we end up treating schools and cities different than churches, but I think we need to address this issue before it gets out of hand. And to me, out of hand would be, 6 packs of beer, $4.99, this, and then being immediately followed up with, Excedrin, 2 for $1, and whatever the case may be. That's not the kind of changeable advertising that I would be interested in seeing. But where there's events, that sort of thing, I could see that happening, and I will admit that it makes perfect sense to me that gasoline prices can be quickly adjusted up or down without going out into the parking lot with a big stick and a suction cup. So, I think I would like us to pay some attention to that, and I would consider allowing, personally, it would not offend me to allow churches that have different programs and things going on, but I don't necessarily want them changing every 8 seconds like the advertising electronic boards we have in our entertainment district, for instance. So somewhere where we perhaps have allowed the hand changeable, we can see about working something out with that.
Yes, thank you for the clarity. We can certainly visit
Mayor.
that.
Go ahead.
I will be brief, sir. I, for one, dislike feather and moving man signs. I think they're the bane of this city's existence. I do know that we put stronger regulations that are very dependent upon code enforcement. So I would send a message to code that when this UDC is adopted, the community is expecting them to do due diligence and enforce temporary sign ordinances as they will exist at that time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Council. And last topic, certainly another robust topic, but I can just share that we wanted to end on this newer topic because it was something that was top of mind that was shared with us in terms of how group homes are addressed. So we just wanted to revisit for council's benefit that when we're looking at group homes, there's a certain parameters that we have to be sensitive to, which first is federal law and the Fair Housing Act, and understanding that the Fair Housing Act gives specific accommodations to certain classes as well as those with disabilities. And so within that, Arizona revised statute has additional language that impacts how we can manage group homes within our specific community. So that is particular in the aspect of identifying that in state statute, a residential facility which serves 6 or fewer persons shall be considered a residential use of property for the purposes of all local zoning ordinances. So again, for time purposes, I don't know that we want to get into the details of group homes. What we wanted to at least present to you is to recognize that there was questions or concerns about group homes. We wanted to collect those from council and then go back into the code and make any adjustments. But right now, the current code groups all group home types into one type. So whether that's people with or without disabilities, if it's a facility that's dealing with a drug addiction or a halfway house coming out of prison, those all are kind of captured in group homes, and we have separation requirements and recently approved reasonable accommodation provisions within that. So if there were any specific concerns or preferences that council has relative to group homes, we would be interested in collecting those and then do some more work for you to see how we can address those.
Mayor, if I may, a couple of things. The state statute you cited there deals with facilities that serve 6 or fewer persons. The other language on the slide deals with 6 to 10 disabled or 6 to 11. I would suggest that we not use 6 on both sides of the equation. It should be up to 6 and then 7 and more. And that way we don't have somebody, well, I could go either way because I just have 6. That we should have a clear distinction there. The state statute requires that the facilities with 6 or less provide 24-hour care, day in and day out. So to be just simply considered a residential home. And I'm fine with that. Where my concern comes in is where we're seeing single-family homes in regular single-family neighborhoods being rented out by the bedroom, and oftentimes the garage converted into bedrooms, where there is no licensing and there is no requirement of disability, which would probably require licensing if they were providing care. That concerns me because those are now they're not homes, they're boarding houses, they're mini motels. And so if we can, I would like us to be able to regulate that environment where it's unrelated persons without license or the provision of care that the statute would require. I think those are becoming problematic there. And then, and if care is not provided, if care is not required, it shouldn't be in the name of the definition. So those are my comments at this time. Thank you.
Mayor?
Go ahead.
Thank you. I think, I mean, I have quite a bit to say about this, so I don't know whether you'd rather bring this back for, another discussion. The state requires, so if it's 6 or fewer people, then we can't require a conditional use permit or any kind of, for them to do anything with us. But if it's 7, as Councilmember Turner said, or more people, then we can require a conditional use permit. I was under the impression we couldn't do that. And then I feel like we need to make a distinction between the ones where we can have some sort of a little more, if you're in treatment, recovery, you're considered anybody that's the same as being considered any disability group home that's assisting people with a disability. But if it's not, if it's a halfway house or people who are on parole or those kinds of things, I think we have a lot more leeway of what we're able to do and how we're able to regulate that. So I'd like to see differentiate between what type of group home it is, but I think that's a discussion, probably a larger discussion that we might want to move to another day, just in the interest of time, but that's kind of where I'm at. I think we really should recognize the difference between a halfway house of people who are, being monitored on parole and a home that's, 8 or 9 or 10 elderly patients living there for the assisted living type of environment. Thank you.
I do actually think we should bring this back, and I'd like the attorney to weigh heavily, because I do remember in the past that we had some issues legally that we had to deal with on similar items. So if it's up with, if everybody's good with it, I'd like to bring this one back too. All right.
Great. Thank you, Mayor and Council. Certainly, yes, that is one topic that is universal in all communities of needing further discussion. So I apologize, we did have one more topic on the good neighbor policy. This may be familiar to council, and so we just wanted to bring this back to your attention. The good neighbor policy in terms of wireless communication facilities. So the current city code has provisions for wireless communication facilities and regulating them in the city code. That's section 7.600. What the proposed UDC provides is bringing that existing language from the city code into the Unified Development Code. And then from there, we would start looking at applying that good neighbor policy. So when a wireless communication facility is proposed adjacent to residentially zoned property, that's when it would trigger this good neighbor policy. And the policy would essentially be looking at, for city-owned property, a minimum 300-foot setback, which would increase by 20 feet for every 5-foot increase in height above 65 feet, up to a maximum allowed height for that wireless communication facility type. So I'm trying to avoid getting into the weeds in terms of the specifics that the current code allows, but they have height limits on the various types of wireless facilities. So you have concealed facilities, which you couldn't distinguish driving by. Then we have disguised facilities, might be your palm or your pine trees, or then visible ones that are just stand alone. So all three of those types in the current code have unique provisions for them. And so they have height requirements and certain design requirements associated with them. So for our good neighbor policy, we're identifying that at minimum for city-owned property, it would be 300-foot setback, and then that additional setback and as the height increases. The question, I think, for council consideration from a good neighbor policy would be consider the CUP process versus the administrative review process for these facilities. So when these facilities are being proposed, would council prefer taking it through a conditional use permit process, or if certain provisions are in place, would an administrative review process be sufficient?
Questions by the council?
Mayor, Vice Mayor.
Councilmember
So
Calabunto.
this would only be for city-owned property?
Correct.
Well, administrative process doesn't notify, there's no notification required, right?
Well, in the draft code, there would be, under the administrative review process, there would be a notification process associated with it.
I would lean towards the conditional use permit, just because I think that there needs to be more of a formal, notifying. I mean, and this morphed out of something that happened in my district. So, and I know right now, I think it's 150 feet.
Correct.
Which is really, really close, especially for a 77-foot tower. I mean, it can be seen inside people's homes. So, but I think that, I've said this before, I think the city should be the best neighbor people have, not the worst neighbor people have. And so I think, going through an actual zoning case with a conditional use process is, I think, appropriate when we're putting one of these within even 300 feet of residential homes. That's my opinion.
Yes, you're good.
I think that's the direction we'll take. With that, Mayor, I'll certainly offer any additional questions that any council may have, but in terms of next steps, We're looking to finalize edits to the UDC in November so that hopefully we can be in a position to take the UDC forward in December and possibly final adoption in January. But I know we talked about today coming back with specific topics, so we'll have to see how that plays into that timeline. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Mayor.
Mayor, I have one additional topic for consideration in addition to the marijuana and the group homes. And I don't think it's been consolidated anywhere as to the extent of the planning director's unilateral authority. It occurs within design review and other instances as well. I think council needs to see a compilation of those areas where there is exclusive decision-making power by the planning director or planning administrator, because I think that's a topic that really deserves some overview. And are there instances where a planning director's decision may be appealed or get some oversight in terms of the planning commission or city council? But I am just concerned that we are increasing the amount of authority for the planning director, and most of us don't even know that it's happening. Thank you.
All right, you finished?
Complete.
Okay, can you introduce item number 2?
Presentation regarding splash pad operations.
Mayor, members of the council, here to provide staff report on item number 2 on our agenda is our Parks Recreation Facility Special Events Director, Mr. Jim Burke.
Thank you, Mr. Phelps. Mayor, members of council, good afternoon. So splash pads have become quite an item in our business here recently. As recently as the 2021 approval of our department master plan, we had survey data that the community was very interested in splash pads. And then after the construction of the O'Neill splash pad, a lot of good feedback from council and the community about that particular item and the interest in seeing it elsewhere. As part of our CIP program, or capital improvement program for 2023 through 2032, we included 9 splash pads. 3 of them were full-scale splash pads, which would be very similar to the O'Neill project. One at Sunset Palms, which is under construction. Saguaro Ranch Park, which is going through a master plan process right now, and if it identifies that as a site to be a consideration. And then Sierra Verde Park was identified, but we haven't done any detailed planning work on that pending this workshop or any other direction from council. Some small-scale sites were considered. We haven't actually determined the sites, but you'll see in the next exhibit we have some recommendations from staff. But we have not done any community outreach. We haven't talked to the council specifically about these particular sites yet. And we can do that today or at another time. And then we have renovations proposed for 3 splash pads that are already existing in the system. One at Heroes Regional Park, one at Sycamore Grove, and one at the Grand Canal Linear. That's at 75th and Camelback. So this exhibit is a document that staff put together to kind of look at the overall city, and I apologize for the viewers, it might be a little bit small, but the items that are identified in green are existing facilities that have splash pad elements. Foothills Recreation Center has a play feature, and the Sycamore Grove Park, as I mentioned, has a splash pad. It is not operational at the moment. The Heroes Regional Park has a splash pad. Grand Canal Linear has a small one. Again, it's not operational. The O'Neill Park that we just built, and then Rose Lane Pool in the southern part of the city also has a splash pad element. And then again, the recommended facilities, one at Sierra Verde Park, one at Sunset Palms, and then Saguaro Ranch Park. Those 3 are the full-size facilities like the one we did at O'Neill. And then the small-scale ones, we have one at Greenway Granada proposed in the Saguaro District. And then this exhibit shows two, Sunset and Mission parks, both in the Cactus District. We really intended to be just one of those, and haven't caught up with changing the exhibit. We haven't talked to the councilman in the area, or looked at the parks, or talked to the community at all, but we consider it to be one site. And then Bonsall Park in the south central part of the city in the Ocotillo District. One of the things we're looking at is the recirculating versus the direct-to-drain approach. The O'Neill project that we just built and the Sunset Palms project that we are currently constructing are direct-to-drain projects. The Hero splash pad, the existing one, is a recirculating splash pad. And in talking to our consultants and looking at the projects and reading some of the literature, the pros for the recirculating is it does use a little bit less water than your average municipal pool. They're continuously filtered and the water's reused and it's disinfected and then returned to the spray area. One of the cons is that water treatment equipment has to be installed and paid for and is part of the capital cost, and I'll speak to that in a moment. There's operator input required. For example, at Heroes Splash Pad, we have to have a staff person there over 6 hours a day to do all the things that need to be done to keep that recirculating system going and operational, checking the chemicals, checking the filter condition, backflushing water, et cetera. Versus O'Neill, where we can get by with about 2 hours a day or a little less, just making sure it's operational. And then the increased liability of doing all that right and having the water chemistry right for the users. As I mentioned, there's additional expense. There's permit required for the recirculating system. It is not required for the direct-to-drain with county health department. There's a cost for chemicals. You have to build a pump house. You have the electrical costs for the filter equipment, and then the labor costs, as I mentioned. On the other side, the direct-to-drain, there's no added cost to do that. You only pay for the direct water use. The water is run from the city water pressure, and then it goes directly back to the wastewater system. So in talking with my colleagues in the Water Services Department, they don't have a preference on which of these we use, but they are very comfortable taking the wastewater from these facilities and treating it in the water treatment plant. As you know, they're treating millions of gallons a day, so our little additional water supply is not going to impact that.
Mayor? Thank you, Mayor. How much water, let's say, an operating direct-to-drain splash pad, how much water does it use, like in a day or month, a week, whatever?
I don't have a day.
How much water is going down the drain?
I don't have a day or month, but we have an average annual. It was about 2.2 million at Heroes Park for the last 5 years. For the direct, for the recirculation.
Okay, there's no difference in the water usage in the...
The direct-to-drain's a little bit more. It's probably closer to 3 million.
Okay, thank you.
And that's annual, not. They're easier to operate. There's lower maintenance and less chemicals, obviously, and then there's no exposure to those chemicals either for the user or for staff. Additional pros are faster installation, fewer permits, no pump house required. Our consultant's estimate for the additional equipment to do the recirculation is about $200,000 for the project. With the direct-to-drain, you avoid that cost entirely. Our additional operating costs, we estimate is about $31,000 a year for the staff time and the chemicals to do that recirculation. So those two elements increase the cost a little bit for that version. So again, looking at how we operate them now, we currently operate from 11, sorry, that slide says PM, but it's 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. And we propose, we're in stage one right now. The city manager's directed a stage one drought plan. It's looking at a 5% reduction of all city water citywide, and we would recommend that this next season when we operate those, we reduce them by 1 hour a day to get to that point where we're using a little less water. If we go into stage two, which is very likely in the near future, I haven't heard an actual date or time, but I expect it anytime sooner into 23, we'd reduce it another hour. So it would be 11 to 5. If we go into stage three, our recommendation would be we'd operate these weekends only, which is what we're doing in August now. We run in July and June typically, and then in August go to weekends only. If we get to stage three where you're doing a mandatory reduction for residents across the city, we could look at this. And then in stage four, we'd recommend closing them down entirely if we get to that severity. all of these are just preliminary recommendations and, of course, up for discussion and dialogue with the council of how you'd like to address that. In talking again with our colleagues in the Water Services Department, they recommend that we go back to the two that are operational and the one that's being built right now and put in these automatic meters that can be read remotely so that they can capture all the water use by day and by hour. And then, Councilperson, we could answer that question, I think, a little more specifically a year from now if we do that installation and then we have that data and how they're being used. We can see the peak. We can see if they're coming early in the morning, if families are coming midday or late in the day, or what the dynamic is. And that would help us then to create a plan going forward on how to manage these facilities. And then what we're looking for today is some council direction on how you'd like to proceed. Do you want us just to stop what we're doing and not be doing any new splash pads going forward or for some period of time? Do you want us to continue them as planned and build all the ones that are in this plan? Or should we talk about a hybrid? And I proposed a couple possible scenarios in hybrid, but that's open for discussion.
Mayor?
Go ahead.
Thank you. What is the difference between full scale and small scale? Can you explain that?
Yeah, the full scale is, Mayor, members of council, full scale ones are like the O'Neill Park one. It's about 3,000 square feet of wet surface area with quite a few apparatus and pumps and valves. Well, the small scale is more like, and I don't have the exact number, but the one at Sycamore Grove, it only has 5 or 6 different emitters in an open area. It's not fenced. It doesn't have the same control features. We would put a control valve on it so that we could say it only can operate on certain times of day and limit the amount of run time. But right now, we don't really have any of those in operation, those small ones.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. So the issue is essentially the CAP, at least for me, the ones that are using CAP water, which is just the ones that are operating north of the canal. Is that right?
Well, those are, Mayor, members of the council, those are technically in the off-project area, but in talking to our colleagues in the water department, we're using city water in all of them. So I can't say that, yes, that's the case, that it's only the CAP water.
Well, north of the canal, I think
It's a blend.
Right. So, I mean, my thought is, I mean, I know that these are being funded with money that has to be spent by December of 2024. Is that right?
Mayor, members of council, it is the ARPA funding the council's allocated. My understanding is it has to be committed by that time and spent by the end of 26, but I could check with finance and get back to you if those dates are wrong.
So we have some time to decide. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what the right thing to do is. I think, as a city, we should be setting a really good example and not wasting water because we want people to not waste water. So, I mean, I would be okay if we have some time to just work on what we're already working on and wait and see. I mean, we're going to know a little bit more. I don't know what the next date is where we're going to, I think we're waiting for the Department of the Interior. Is that where we're at with,
I believe so, yes.
I mean, the longer we wait, the more information we'll have, so we don't have to decide this right now today. What's already underway, I feel like we should continue on with. If we've got another almost 2 years to make a commitment on whether we're going to move forward with these projects, we have the money. We can sit tight and see what happens. I have a feeling, and then if there's a lot more restrictions on use of Colorado River water, we have the option of maybe doing the recirculating ones that are north of the canal and then the direct to drain, the ones that are south of the canal, which is, I guess, would be considered a hybrid. I mean, I don't want to scrap the whole idea of putting these splash pads in because I know they're popular. It's a free way to entertain your kids for hours, which I was always looking for a free way to entertain kids for hours. So I think we should still try to do this, but I don't know if today's the right day for us to make a decision about this because we don't really have to. And the longer we wait, the more information we're going to have. Thank you, Mayor.
Mr. Melvin.
Thank you, Mayor. Recently, as was mentioned, the Sunset Palms Park started construction. And I want to kind of relate, and I've talked to some council members about this already, but there was quite a bit of concern from the residents. We held a special meeting, and a pretty large quantity of folks came out to that meeting. And Parks and Rec was there to help guide and direct us in that meeting. But the bottom line, that there were two main concerns. The first concern was they wanted to make sure they had input on what was going on in the city. You know, and we explained that we've been talking about this for years, really, and we put out notices, but the people were not really notified in this neighborhood of what was going on. Unlike O'Neill Park, where there was a wild enthusiasm, but there's also, O'Neill Park is a larger, more regional park. And these neighborhoods are, you know, the smaller parks. And so that was the first concern, is do we want to put splash pads in the smaller parks versus putting them in just our regional parks? And so that was a concern that they had. They had various concerns about putting the splash pads in the park, which I won't go into at this point. But the main thing is they wanted input, wanted to know about it, and however we move forward, and we've discussed this, we need to do, I would advise each council member to hold a public meeting in that neighborhood for that application. The second biggest concern was water usage. There was a real concern, given that we are in a drought condition, and we believe, based on anticipated projections that are still yet to come forward, that it's going to not get any better. And that was a real concern. We had already committed on Sunset Palms. We had already let contracts, and so we really had a difficult time saying, you know, it cost us probably as much or more money to stop the project than just to go ahead with it. So at that point in time, you know, we informed the residents that we were moving forward, we were making some adjustments in our plan, and they seemed to be okay with that. But they were still concerned about the water usage and if this drought continues. And we've addressed that in part here on how we would address the timing. One thing that wasn't mentioned is these splash pads are operated by demand. In other words, if there's nobody there, it's not running. Is that correct?
Mayor and Councilman, that is correct.
Okay, so you have to push a button when people are there. So it's not like it's running continuously. And that was very comforting to know for the residents. And I think I wanted to bring that up so others know that. But very frankly, based on this experience, I am going to recommend that this council hold off doing an additional splash pads until we get a better projection regarding our water usage. Thank you, Mayor.
Mayor, thank you. A couple of questions and comments. It seems counterintuitive that we're in a drought stage and staff is recommending doing away with recirculation, which saves water, and instead wants to go to a water down the drain on demand. It doesn't make sense to me, being in a drought. I know the cost is greater, the care is greater, the chemicals are greater, but you have to balance that against being in a drought. And so I would like more information on exactly the usage of water down the drain versus recirculating. Get us better data on that. I, like everyone else, am nervous about moving forward with new splash pads under our current conditions. It makes sense to wait. But the idea of renovating the existing ones should be done. This is a service that many people are used to. When I go by Heroes in the summertime, there are kids all over that splash pad all day long. It's a service they're used to receiving, and I don't think that they should be penalized because we want to hold off on building new ones. So I think that the renovation of the existing ones should move forward. I think we should wait on new ones but I certainly would like to see information. I mean, I want a real cost comparison. You said it costs $200,000 extra dollars to put recirculating on there. What's the cost? So you have to add that plus the chemicals plus the manpower and give us a true cost for recirculating versus down the drain. And we have to decide whether in a drought it's worth it to send all that water down the drain. Thank you.
If you do one other thing when you do that, also check and find out, the very reason we went splash pads is because it's, by far, we save a lot of water over a swimming pool and maintenance and all that. So do those comparisons also. I'm a little leery that we choose not to do a project that we already have funding set aside for. And if the water's not available, we just don't turn them on. But that doesn't mean 2 years later, we may not have water available that we could then just turn the water on. So I don't know if I'd get overzealous about not doing projects if the money has already been appropriated.
Thank you, Mayor. You reminded me of a question that I had forgotten to ask is, let's say that we build them, I mean, I've already said I think we should at least go forward with what we are already working on and pause everything else. But if we were to go ahead and then we end up turning them off, I mean, just like in a house, I mean, you turn off water and you don't circulate water through, then you end up with damage. And, you know, so I don't know whether there would be a cost to shutting the things down for a season or two. Would they have to be completely replumbed then after you've, you know, I don't know what if you could bring that back too, we would know if we end up having to shut it off for a whole year, what does that do to the system?
Mayor, members of council, we can talk to consultants and get some advice on that. But yes,
Okay.
you're right. Any moving parts that aren't being used and operated will tend to seize up if it sits too long.
Right.
Whether that's 1 or 2 seasons, I don't know. But if it's a decade, it certainly could be a problem. But we'll get
It
back
would be
to you.
good information to have before we make a decision. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mayor. I was actually in favor of giving consensus today to move forward. I think I feel these splash pads bring a quality of life to our communities, to our neighborhood parks. I think there could be a situation where if the splash pad is too big in a neighborhood park, there may bring maybe a feeling that there's more people at the park than from that neighborhood, migrating in, if you will. But that's yet to be seen. I do feel like it's an amenity that communities need, and I say that by experience with O'Neill Park. It's been a great amenity to the community, and I was ready to move forward right now on not only renovating, but also the new splash pads. But if it's tabled, I can wait for that data as well.
Yes, Mayor, I just wanted to respond to the concern about delaying projects. And if we choose as a council to not do, say, you know, the ones that are in progress, go ahead and continue those that are already set, and there may be a couple of those. But what I got from the community meeting was the residents really had a lot of great ideas of what they would like to see in their neighborhood parks. And it wasn't necessarily a splash pad, but there were a lot of other amenities they would like to see. And so I think we could reprogram that money and do it on a park-by-park basis based on what is the perceived need or want, so to say, to improve a park. I mean, I drive around my district and I look at the parks. You know, I'm really happy to see that we put money into the irrigation system because it's desperately needed in all our parks, and especially the ones in my district. So that's going to be a big improvement when that is completed. But there are other amenities I think we could consider other than just a splash pad to make sure that we utilize these monies that we have programmed for parks, still use the money for parks, but perhaps change it a little bit if we find that we can do that. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. A few things. It does seem counterintuitive that a splash pad design that goes from splash to drain, I forget how you termed it, would actually perhaps be a better use of water than the recirculating system that has the filters and treatment. plant to it. One of the important differences to understand, though, is that the water that enters our drainage system goes back to water treatment plants where it gets purified to virtually drinking water standards and is either then used in places like the lakes and landscaping and things like that, or more importantly to me, it's put back in the ground, it's recharged into our aquifer, where then it can be drawn out later in the future, put back through a freshwater treatment plant and become part of our freshwater system. So that water doesn't just go away just because it went down the drain. It's still our water, it's still valuable, we still use it. But for the filter system and the chemical treatment and all of that, it said in here that at some point it just goes out into the park, into the turf area, I guess, of the park and is there. So that ends the use. Once we do that, that ends the use of that water. Whereas the other stays reusable, more or less indefinitely in various ways to us. So this is difficult. It's a difficult subject, and we do want to have messaging, but we want the messaging that we use to be appropriate and be accurate. My primary concern is for splash pads and water uses that are at this point north of the Arizona Canal, because that is primarily Colorado River water up there. Yes, now some Colorado River water does get used south of the canal, particularly in January during canal dry up or things like that. But the stress point in water that we're experiencing is on Colorado River and those reservoirs. The Salt River system, which is south of the canal, is healthy, and the most recent prognosis is that it's going to remain that way. I think the reservoirs are somewhere between 60 and 70% full, I think, and that the impacts that they're seeing in the Rockies we aren't seeing here locally as much. So Salt River Project has recently had a positive prognosis for the water supply. So I don't think it necessarily serves us as far as being accurate in our messaging to residents to not try to distinguish it to some extent, and then also to eliminate an amenity that is viable in the Salt River part of our system, to eliminate that such that people who live north of the canal can't come down and enjoy that amenity even though there's water for it. To me, that's not what we want to do either. I do absolutely appreciate what Councilmember Malnar described and ran into with the park that he's in. Putting a regional amenity into a local park creates stresses and frictions that the neighborhood wasn't expecting, and rightfully so. Now, Saguaro Ranch Park is a regional park within the Salt River Project system, and I see no legitimate reason to slow down putting a splash pad in that park. I think it's something that neighbors have expected, and I've heard plenty from, as I've worked that neighborhood for 8 years now and represented them. And I think that that's certainly one that we should consider moving forward with, because it has neither the water stress issue nor the regional amenity in a local park issue. So I would like us to not delete that one from the list. Thank you.
Clear as mud, right?
I think we got pretty good direction, yes.
Okay. You good?
I'm good.
Okay. Let's get this last one done.
Presentation regarding City Code Chapter 24 revisions.
Mayor, members of the council, here to provide staff report on this is Deputy City Manager Rick St. John.
Good afternoon, Mayor, members of council. We are seeking council consensus today on a couple of revisions to Chapter 24. One we've discussed at length in previous workshops. I'll start with that one, and that is the lot size distinction in Section 2468. In June of 2021, when we adopted the new Chapter 2468 revisions, we changed the lot size distinction from what it was in the past at 12,000 square feet down to 8,000 square feet. Since then, we've done enforcement. We've been in the community. We believe that it needs to be adjusted back to 12,000 square feet for consistency with the UDC and equity and enforcement out in the field. In an initial conversation with council several months ago now, council asked for more examples of properties that were in compliance prior to this change that are now out of compliance. So I've included those examples from each of your districts in this presentation, and you can see those printed out in front of you. But to make it clear, these properties were in compliance prior to the change in June of 2021. They are no longer in compliance as the code is written today. And so we're requesting that it be amended back to the 12,000 square foot distinction. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mayor. You and I have spoken about this quite a bit, and one of the topics that I think would be advantageous to kind of have a discussion here about, or to bring forward, would be that even though this process will bring back into compliance some people who are out of compliance under the current code, it was the intention of the code committee, the code review committee, to change that in order to bring some people into compliance that were out of compliance. And how will we deal with those people now that were out of compliance? The code committee recommended bringing them into compliance, and now we're recommending to put them back out of compliance. How will we deal with those people?
So, Mayor, Councilmember Malinar, there are provisions in the Unified Development Code that allow for the planning administrator to make some decisions and allows a person an opportunity to seek relief or variance. And then additionally, when you're dealing with things in the UDC, and the attorney can weigh in on this, there is a, if the city has allowed somebody to park a certain way or to use a certain portion of their front yard for parking and maneuvering for the last, say, 20+ years, then going in and doing strict enforcement off of Chapter 24 may put the city at risk for a lawsuit. And so the city attorney and the code official have an opportunity to sit and discuss cases individually that are brought forth on whether it's in the city's best interest to pursue the case. So there are mechanisms for people that were out of compliance prior to the change. So making that distinction very clear, they were out of compliance. This change brought them into compliance, moved others out of compliance. So either direction the council decides to go, there are going to be people that need to take advantage of the opportunity that having it in the UDC or the zoning ordinance provides. We just think that for consistency in the UDC, designating between R1 properties, SR properties, RR properties, R1 I mean, the UDC makes very clear distinctions on those designations. And in Chapter 24, we've shifted that a little bit. And so we're recommending that it go back to equal distinctions as are currently in the UDC and will be in the new UDC when it's adopted.
Okay, thank you for that. And that's why I wanted to bring it up, because it is a confusing issue. And I think that the public need to understand that, you know, as we go through these code revisions, we're trying to make rules that will benefit the community. It's going to help improve the looks of the community, but there's always going to be some exceptions, and there's going to be some needs for maybe some tweaking. And even with this, we may need to tweak it. For example, this will affect, I guess, housing, new housing. I mean, we don't have a lot of large housing projects going on, so those over the 12,000 square foot, I don't know that we have a lot of those in the city right now. But would it be safe to still have the two sets of parameters, one for existing housing and one for new housing that does come along?
Mayor, Councilmember Malinar, if you're asking, should the UDC say one thing and
Correct.
the Chapter 24 say something different, there's also language in the zoning ordinance that says where there is a conflict, the zoning ordinance prevails. And so I'm not sure, I believe we would have trouble enforcing if those were different, if there were different levels.
Okay, so, okay, all right. All right, thank you, Mayor.
Anyone else? All right, is there a consensus to move forward?
This is on going from the 8,000 back to the 12,000 square feet.
Yes.
I'm okay with that.
No, I don't know if there's a consensus or not.
I'm in.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes, you do have a consensus.
Thank you. The second is a much easier topic. The second deals with measuring the width of, the maximum allowable width of a driveway. Currently, the code reads that it's measured from the front setback, which typically exists 5 to 7 feet on somebody's property, and code is not allowed to go onto the property to make that measurement. So we're requesting that it be amended so the measurement can be made at the property line, so the inspector can stand, say, on the sidewalk and measure from that point the maximum width. And I'd be happy to answer any questions about that item as well.
Fine.
Thank you. That
done?
concludes my presentation.
Okay, we have 20 minutes to get this last one done.
Mayor, members of the council, I've been told this is approximately a 10-minute presentation, so we should have
That should work out perfect.
room for plenty of questions. So at this time, our final item in the workshop, presented by our Transportation Director, Shahid Abbas.
Is Ryan Lee presenting with him? Is Ryan Lee presenting with him? No?
I think we should be okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I got the information from him. Thank you, City Manager Phelps. My name is Shahid Abbas, Director of Transportation. Mayor and respected council, today I shall provide you a brief update on the status of Proposition 400 extension. The original Proposition 400 was passed in 2004 to fund transportation projects and program in Maricopa County, which is set to expire at the end of 2025. In anticipation of the need to extend Proposition 400 beyond the 2025 end date, a 25-year extension of the funding was proposed as Proposition 400 extension. The extension of Proposition 400 is critical to fund the transportation needs in Maricopa County and particularly the city of Glendale. The proposed proposition extends the half-cent transportation sale tax for 25 years after 2025. Both Senate and House passed the bill, however, Governor Ducey vetoed the bill on July 6th of this year. NOMAG is planning to complete the projects included in Proposition 400. And this includes adding a general purpose lane in both directions of the Loop 101 from 75th Avenue to I-17. Now, what does the veto mean for Glendale? A loss of $1.2 billion in new capital investment for freeway and arterial improvement projects, and $14.4 million per year for transit program in the city of Glendale. This slide shows potential funding impact on the city if Proposition 400 extension fails. Transit will lose $14.4 million per year. Proposition 400 extension included $205 million for the city's 10 arterial projects that we shall lose. Similarly, there were 14 ADOT freeway projects for a total of $1 billion within or adjacent to the city, which provides direct benefit to the city transportation system that will be gone. This slide shows the breakdown of the transit impacts. Under Proposition 400, we received $5.8 million per year. Under Proposition 400 extension, we were to receive $14.4 million per year for the same program. The loss of Proposition 400 extension funding will result in following impacts on transit. All 3 routes of express bus service will be discontinued. 4 of the 12 fixed routes will be discontinued. All weekend service of fixed route will be discontinued. Service before 6 and after 6 p.m. will be discontinued. ADA service will be reduced because changes made to the fixed routes, and dial-a-ride service on weekend will be discontinued. This slide shows impact on the city's arterial streets. We have 10 arterial projects included as shown on the slide in Proposition 400 extension for a total cost of $293 million. Out of this, $205 million were coming from Proposition 400 extension, and remaining $88 million was local match from GeoBond. This slide shows the impact on freeway project for an estimated cost of over $1 billion. These projects provided direct benefit to the city transportation system. And that concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Nothing but good news.
Wonderful.
Anything I say would get me in trouble.
All right. What I would like is I'd like Mr. Lee to come up here and just take 2 minutes to tell us sort of legislatively where we're at and the tactics that we're trying to use. And again, keep it really short if you would.
I'll do my best. Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. Since the veto, there's been a lot of effort to try to work with Governor Ducey and his staff to call a special session. The feedback that we're receiving is that he doesn't want to call a special session, but really everything depends on what happens today with the election, and also what happens when the majority and the minority parties select their leadership. So there's a lot at play there. In the situation where the governor does agree to call a special session, one thing he's made very clear is that 25 years is a tax increase, and he's held his firm stance that he is not going to increase taxes in his time in office. So the MAG member agencies, Glendale included, have agreed to maintain a 25-year transportation plan, which is what we negotiated for about 24 months through MAG, but seek a 20-year tax authorization. So we would fund the first 4 phases of this transportation plan, each phase being 5 years. What that means for Glendale is we would still have major arterial funding and freeway funding programmed for the city. We'd also have our transit operations covered as well as with what Shahid had mentioned. So if we're in a situation in the next couple of days where we feel like a special session is achievable, we have a plan to seek legislative authorization for a 20-year tax.
Questions? No? Yeah, so this is something we've been working on, and it's going to be a difficult situation, very difficult.
Mayor, one thing I failed to mention, we're also in the early stages, and we need to be in the discussions of what do we do if the legislature does not give us authorization. And so we're, with Mr. Phelps's leadership, we're talking as a region about, do we go out for a referendum and do a citizens initiative? I said referendum. Do we go out for a citizens initiative and try to really force the issue? But if we do that, it has to be statewide, because even though Maricopa County is the only county in the state that has to seek legislative authorization, because that's in statute, we also have to go to a statewide vote to change that. So we're working simultaneously on special session in the short term or evaluating all of our options if we have to do a citizens initiative. Thank you.
Mayor, could I, just to clarify for people who may be watching and may not understand, is too that the Governor Ducey decided to veto literally completely out of left field. I mean, there was, the ninth floor was involved in these negotiations all along. However, we are where we are. But just so that people understand that literally this was just to refer it to the voters anyway. So no matter which path, it was still going to go to the voters to approve. So just want to make sure people understand that it wasn't automatically going to, it was just, the idea was to send it to the ballot for the voters to approve. So.
Okay. Is that it? All right, next item is the city manager's report. Mr. Phelps.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I have several different items here to share with you in my report today. You know, one of the things I have a pleasure doing is working for 7 bosses that are all, I think, individually very supportive of our veterans community. And so the timing of my announcement, you know, couldn't be better as we get ready to celebrate Veterans Day on Friday. But the Glendale Housing Authority has just received an award letter from HUD, from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and this is for supported housing vouchers. The award will allow our housing division to work directly with the Phoenix Veterans Affairs organization on referrals to house up to 20 veteran households in our community. And so there will be a required council action to accept the funding, which we'll be voting on in the future. As always, want to thank Jean and her team at Community Services for seeking this opportunity and to expand the way we can help continue to serve our veterans community here in Glendale. Second news, a bit of good news as well. As you know, the City Council provided some direction to help assist the developer of the Gaslight Inn, which had facing really some significant kinds of development issues that could even maybe forced it being torn down. Well, we were able to find a solution for that, and we just found out they've just signed their first tenant, which is called Simple Machine Brewing Company. This is a very popular brewery, opening their second Valley location. In 2022, it was voted as best brewery by Phoenix Magazine, and they're working very quickly to get open prior to the Super Bowl, and then they'll also be doing a full renovation of the joint space that will provide additional area for both indoor and outdoor seating, and including a music venue. So this is great news for our downtown. And again, I think the council, you know, made the right decision to invest in this historic piece of property, and then we're already seeing the fruits of that with this news. Also, just real quickly, I received correspondence from both YAM Properties via Dan Dahl and from Steve Everhart representing the Renaissance Hotel, who is making a formal request that the council consider changing the name of Coyotes Boulevard. And so they have they've kind of talked amongst themselves, realizing this is a council process. They've made a couple recommendations. They've got one name in particular that they like, but they want to be respectful of the process. So, you know, we are bringing this back shortly for a council workshop so that you can decide, A, do you want to move forward with it? And then B, if so, what would you like to change? We believe we should act on this quickly if we are going to change, so that we can have all the signage in place prior to the Super Bowl. There are only 2 businesses that are affected by this, which is the Renaissance Hotel and YAM. So having those 2 on board, this is a very simple process, and so we'll be leaning on the council mayor provision for seeking a name change. The next item is not quite so good news. So last week, the city has been notified by legal counsel that for the Chicago White Sox that they will be preparing to take legal action against the city of Glendale to resolve a dispute at Camelback Ranch. And we also anticipate that the Los Angeles Dodgers will also be part of these legal proceedings. Now, by way of background, just a reminder that the city built Camelback Ranch, which is a state-of-the-art spring training facility back in 2009, to be used for the Dodgers and Chicago White Sox. Sits on 141 acres, has 13 complete baseball fields, 3 half fields, includes more than 120,000 square feet of locker rooms and administrative support area, and also includes 12 luxury suites. City borrowed approximately $200 million to build this facility, which include the construction, outfitting all of the equipment within the facility, and also to stabilize it for our bond payments. The city then entered into a 25-year lease, and we get, as part of that 25-year lease, each team pays $1 per year to the city. So we get total over the 25 years, we get $50 in lease payments. But they also retain then all ticket revenue, all food and beverage revenue, and all merchandising revenue. We do get a small amount back in sales tax generated through an interlocal agreement with the city of Phoenix, and that typically averages about $60,000 a year. On top of that, the city provides the facility approximately $1.4 million annually to help them maintain the facility and to keep it really up to full standards. I think one could say that arguably the teams have the best spring training lease arrangement and the best spring training facility in the entire Cactus League. Now, the teams are wanting the city of Glendale and our citizens to build and construct separate locker rooms for female employees. And the city believes that this is a cost that should be borne by the teams and not the citizens of Glendale. The estimated net worth of these two teams exceeds $7 billion. So we believe this is something that in the greater sense of how our lease agreement is put together, we believe this is something that we will support them building out and changing for locker facilities for their females, but it shouldn't be a cost built into our capital. As you can probably see, I'm pretty disappointed and discouraged by the fact that that legal proceedings will be moving forward against the city of Glendale. But the gentleman sitting next to me is going to aggressively represent our interest on this. Just to let you know, we've been denying several things that we feel are not consistent with the agreement. I mean, this went back as far as a couple years ago where they asked to fund as part of a capital improvement plan the replacement of chairs in locker rooms to the tune of $250 per chair. They also had a request last year to replace 2 whiteboards for $2,400, which we said no to. And they also wanted to replace a damaged phone in one of the booths where the pitchers are at. So we're hoping we can resolve this, but again, I think ultimately what I would be hopeful for is that our two teams, which are important partners for us, but they would acknowledge that they've got a great situation, that the city of Glendale and its citizens built them a phenomenal facility. We get $1 a year, so we can't go much lower on the lease, maybe to free, I guess. But on these kinds of things, we think that it's a fair request to have them operationally figure out how they're going to provide locker rooms for their female employees. There'll be more to come in this. Probably at this point, we'll move into executive session in the future on issues as they come up. But for now, I just wanted to know by the council of what's taking place. The last 2 items real quickly. Our new Glendale Airport Administrator, Matthew Smith, is here in the audience today, and so just want to introduce Matthew. Matthew comes from the Grand Canyon Airport, which is owned by ADOT, and we're excited to have him on board, and he has a fairly a lot of things on his plate, and we're looking forward to his leadership at the airport. And finally, maybe the best news of all, just want to congratulate you and all the people listening to this, is that here in another less than 12 hours, we will be able to wake up and turn on the television set and not see any political ads. So congratulations to all of us for that great momentous occasion. Mr. Mayor, that does conclude my report.
Thank you. City Attorney's report?
Nothing to report at this time.
Council items of special interest. Councilmember Clark.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I am going to be supporting Councilmember Tomachoff's request to look at gain. This is something we both talked about, and we think it's time for a change. So Councilmember Tomachoff will introduce it, but I support it fully.
Councilmember Hugh.
Nothing, Mayor.
Councilmember Milner.
I'll support that too.
Okay,
No
I'm
other
still waiting to
comments.
find out what it is before we
Okay, well,
support
I
it.
will tell you right now. Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to have staff bring back a discussion about game night. The only game night that I've ever experienced was when I was newly elected. I went with and experienced how they did game night, and I don't understand how you can be getting Arizonas in the neighborhoods when you're making them go across town to go to somebody else's neighborhood. I don't feel like that was the reason for doing game night. I understand it was probably a lot of work because I think there was a lot of driving around. I drove myself around. The PD, I think the CAT team took Councilmember Martinez around. But I'd like to take another look at it. I think it's really important to get our neighborhoods engaged together, and I'm not sure how that's working with what we're doing right now, is picking a central location and telling people that's where you need to go. So I'd like to have that brought back. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor?
Go ahead.
Since this is a council item of special interest, maybe let you know, actually the mayor had brought this issue forward, been working with the police chief and Deputy City Manager Rick St. John. We are planning on moving back to the GAIN model. That was changed really right as I was coming on board as city manager back in 2016. We concur. We think that the GAIN model really got us an opportunity to get our elected officials out into the community to form more neighborhood groups, and so we'll do that. So what I'll do, if you're okay with the request, as we come back through the process, especially budgeting, we'll have an update in terms of what our plans are. It won't be for, I think, this fall, if I understand, but it will be part of our future approaches for this.
Mayor, if I could, thank you. I appreciate that, and I think it's not even as important as elected officials, but it's important for neighbors to congregate together and for them to meet and interact with public safety personnel also, which is also part of what GAIN Night really, really is about. So thank you, I appreciate that.
See, I already knew what it was before you did it, huh? Councilmember Turner.
I would like to join in on the dog pile regarding GAIN and take the opportunity to congratulate my Shangri-La neighborhood, who has had an annual GAIN night every year for over 20 now, I think, and they just held a successful one last weekend. And then for items of special interest, I would like to request one regarding the tiny homes that we talked about earlier today, and bring that back as an item for us to develop a policy, or at least try to develop policy regarding that. And then my second one would be, I'm requesting a update on the Glen Lakes remainder parcel and where we stand on its eventual sale. We reached some discussions, some consensus back in February, I believe, but I'd like the council and our residents to know where we stand on that. Thank you.
None tonight.
Okay, and then going back to the GAIN thing, the thing that I had brought up to our city manager quite some time ago, I think it originally came from former police chief Black, where she was trying to save the city some money, save a lot of the officers' time running around. And I understood why she was trying to do it. I didn't agree with the reason we were doing it, because I think that the only way that you really accomplish the goal of what I believe that GAIN was intended to do is the neighbors have to know who the neighbors are. They have to know what car belongs in the driveway, and they need to be able to talk to each other. And I thought that we were accomplishing that goal by everybody going to one location. You have people from all over. In fact, you're doing exactly the opposite at that very time. You're taking people out of the neighborhood, away from the neighborhood, and you're leaving your home exposed to people that don't know if you're home or not home. So I'm excited the fact that we can get back to where we used to be. My first couple years, I think I had 18 or 19 places that I went to that night, and I'm totally good with that. I don't have a problem doing that again. In fact, I look forward to it. But I think it's going to be incumbent upon all the council members that all of us work very hard to make sure that your districts understand that it's going to be up to them to put it on, and then whatever you can do to help support that, I think we'll make that successful. So with that said, we're about 1 minute behind, so we're doing actually pretty good. Now, can I get a motion to go into executive session?
So moved.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed say nay. Appears the ayes have it. Do have it. We're recessed.